Good morning, gardeners. Well, it's just a beautiful morning here in Hawaii. Fall definitely set in last night. We've got a cold front, came from Alaska, sitting way up north over here, drawing northern air down to the island. Last night I knew it was clear and a lot of stars out, and the coqui frogs, which usually go kooky, kooky. Well, I found out when the temperature drops below 60, they can only do coke, coke, coke. Now I got coke frogs in the yard instead of coqui frogs because it dropped to about 58 degrees last night. Might get there or even cooler this evening. Of course, we expect that because we live up the mountain, down the mountain. If you live down in Hilo, it probably stayed in the 60s at least last night. So, Christopher, he's back in the mainland, back to school. I hope you all enjoyed the tour that he and I did here. During that tour, I made a statement that could be considered outrageous, depending on who you are, which background is. And I told you I'd get back to it, so I did. I had mentioned in one of the videos while holding the grapevines here, I told you a story about how I snitched those vines. And I got quite a few reactions from gardeners out there who agreed with me. All right, so far I haven't gotten anybody that says, "Oh no, we're not thieves, we're honest people." And I'm sure there are people out there like that. That probably is one of the main differences between people who are just gardening and great horticulturalists. As I said, all great gardeners and horticulturalists are actually thieves at heart. And I say this with some experience too, because I worked for years and years and years in the nursery industry, and I got to rub elbows, with a lot of the big shots in some of the biggest nurseries in the United States of America, and with so many people involved in plants and horticulture and so on. And once you cross a certain level, and you start going upstairs into the management of these companies, or the people who are really quite important in the plant breeding programs and so on, you find out that what I had said is actually true, and it's true historically. I'm not going to mention any names. I don't want to get anybody in trouble out there, because there were laws violated in some cases, especially when it comes to do with import. That's the biggest problem with it. But some of the larger growers in the United States of America will remain unnamed. Some of the people who were very important to them as far as gathering plants and deciding what would be done. I've heard stories about guys, while in South Africa, ran across a certain plant, I will not mention even the genus and species, that was unlike any they had quite seen in that category, and so the usual reaction was to go ahead and snitch a piece and then smuggle it into the United States. And some of these companies have made a small fortune on these little pieces of snitched plant that were actually smuggled in past customs and so on. The reason I think they smuggle past customs really is just because of all the red tape, and chances are by the time you're cleared to come in, your plant will be dead anyway because it was probably just a piece. And plus, in the very large operations we have, these guys do their own phytosanitary stuff anyway. So if there were any diseases, pests, or whatever, they were going to cook it out before it got out into the field anyhow. So they're not worried about that part of it, really. And so that's not an issue for most of them. And snitching the piece is not so much an issue. I myself, I can't go into a botanical garden, for instance, without spotting something I've never seen before. Now, I am not usually the sort that will break a piece off without asking. Now, I have. Yes, I have. I've done that. But ordinarily, I don't do that because, the plants basically are someone's property somehow. Botanical gardens, of course, are sort of public or school properties or things like this, where it's not so personal as another individual's garden, but I usually, if I find seed, you better believe I'm going to pocket a few. It just happens. That's the way it goes. I think the reason that we do this is, again, that most people who are deeply involved in plants, they really feel in their heart that a plant is the property of the planet Earth, that there really isn't so much, this personal thing that has to go with it. So it's not exactly thievery. Of course, on the other hand, if they take the plant and patent it and you go ahead and propagate it, their lawyers will sue you, that's, it's the way it is. Everything is, goes both ways. But, yeah, I mean, I've been known to do this. I do it frequently, in fact. When I don't think there's any harm, that nobody's around, nobody cares, blah, 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 blah. And in some cases, it is legal. It's like the national park up here, for instance. We are allowed to go in and for private use, allowed to collect, berries, mushrooms, pieces of plants, seeds, and so on. This is firewood, even, for use in the park and so on. So, gathering of plants under some circumstances is completely legal. But there's a lot of stuff out here on my tables. There has been for years that it never would have gotten there if it hadn't been for the fact that I ran across one somewhere, grabbed it, brought it home, propagated it. The poha berries here in my nursery. All the poha berries in my nursery came from one poha plant at about 5,000 feet up on Mauna Loa over here. I was driving up the Mauna Loa road and I went, wow, look at all them poha berries. And I got out and I broke off a piece. I brought it home. It was legal to do that in the national park. There's no reason I couldn't do that. There are places you can't do that, but there it was legal. I checked. And but nevertheless, most of us are not really worried about what's written down in the law books when we do this. We're doing it because we're just obsessed with new plants, stuff we've never seen, and so on. And when we find it, we can't resist. This is a long and ancient story about horticulturalists being thieves. The Harry Lauder's walking stick. If there's anybody out there familiar with the corliss or the hazelnut that's contorted hazelnuts, there was a famous English actor by the name of Harry Lauder who usually walked around with a walking stick that was twisted. And so this plant got his name, but I don't think Harry actually had anything to do with it much. My understanding was, now again, I hear these stories, I don't know how true they are, so if you know more than I do, sure, let me know, I'll straighten the story out. But what I heard was that there was a particular duke in England, and he had come across this contorted hazelnut, and he was so proud of it. It was, a specimen of his garden, and nobody else had one of these. And so it was a real brag. English gardeners are like that. They're some of the biggest horticultural madmen on the planet. And, well, he had a gardener that worked for him who was, more peasant status out of the local town and so on. Well, Harry thought he had property on that, but what he didn't realize is that his gardener had been snitching pieces of that walking stick and growing them out at home, and that almost everybody in the village had his walking stick after a while. It was a shock to Harry when he found out that his plant had been getting around through all the peasantry, This is a story I heard. I actually heard that from the people at Monrovia who propagate that plant up in Oregon and distribute it. I used to buy it from them when I ran nurseries and so on. That's the story that came with the plant from guys in their company that really ought to know. One of the best stories I ever heard. This is my favorite. My favorite is about one of the King Louis. I can't keep their numbers straight, and I won't bother, but there was a King Louis sometime back during the time that the Spanish and the Portuguese and so on were investigating the New World, and the Spanish had brought back from South America the potato, which was a major crop in the Andes for the Incas. They brought it back to Europe with them. Because the potato was in the nightshade family, with deadly nightshade and solanaceas of all sorts, most European peasants saw it as poison, would not touch it. And so that was a hard start to get the potato into the diet in Europe. The tomato had a similar problem. Again, being solanacea, it was considered to be a poison plant in Europe at first. Well, King Louis was a sharp horticulturalist. This was probably one of the Louis that had orangeries, at the palace and all, where they were raising oranges in glass houses and such. He was an avid gardener. And so Louis saw the potato, And at the time in Europe, there was a famine, and people were starving. And, if you're a king, you can't have the peasants starving, because if they starve, they revolt. And it's Frankenstein, with the pitchforks and the torches, and not the castle for the monster. They'll be heading for the king, And so they had guillotines in France at the time, and Louis could see his head falling if he couldn't do something about the fact that the peasants were starving. Louis saw that potato. He said, this is the solution. If we can get the peasants to grow this potato, we'll solve the food problem here in Europe, because they'll have all the carbs, at least, that they need to remain healthy. Louis went ahead and he planted potatoes in the palace garden, and then he offered the yield up to the people. He said, here, take potatoes. Nobody'd take him up on it. They were scared of the things, and so he could not convince the peasants of France, despite the fact they were starving, to eat this thing. They were sure that the king was actually trying to poison them, as the story I get. So, Louis, being a smart guy and an expert horticulturalist, he knew that if he made the potato stealable, it would spread. And so what Louis did was he took all the spuds he had, he planted them along the very outside of the palace garden, right where you could kind of reach through the fence and get your hands on stuff. They put them way to the outside. Then he posted a sign that says, anyone caught stealing potatoes from the king's garden will be put to death. Well, that was all it took. Within 2 weeks, all the potatoes were missing from Louis's garden, and potatoes had spread across all of France, and maybe not completely, but the famine problem was alleviated to some extent because of this potato. And the only way he could get people to accept it was to let them steal it, because when he tried to give it away, they wouldn't take it. I love that story. Okay, I just love it. It's I don't know whether it's true or not. Maybe it isn't, but it's a great story. And it does represent something about people who deal with plants, though. Another story. And this is one that I have. A lot of people who are deep Christians have a big problem with this one. But I lived for quite a while in northern Wisconsin, just south of Lake Superior. And that particular region had a lot of Polish people that had immigrated there years ago, back when dairy farming had been an industry that was being set up by immigration companies who were bringing immigrants from Europe to run these dairy farms. That all fell apart during the Depression, and so today dairy farms are privately owned, and all of the Polish people in my neighborhood were owning their own farms at that time. But Christmas come around, and we start talking about Christmas trees. Of course, that area has pines and spruce and firs and all kinds of wonderful trees that grow naturally in the woods that make great Christmas trees. The balsam fir, for instance, the white pine, all very popular trees. So I was sitting in the tavern up in northern Wisconsin and, talking with the local guys. Christmas was coming. We started talking about Christmas trees, and all the stories start coming out from all the local farmers. And I mean, these are good people. They're, dairy farmers. They work hard, so on and so forth. They're not criminals. Let's put it that way. Nobody who's a criminal would ever be a dairy farmer. You got to be out of your mind. And so I start talking, though, about Christmas trees. Next thing I know, they're all talking about these stories about how they go out, they get drunk, they drive around, and they steal Christmas trees all over the neighborhood. One guy was talking about how they couldn't find a good Christmas tree in the woods, so they went out into one of the neighbors' yards where they had a really nice, well-trimmed spruce and cut the darn thing down and took it home with them. There's so many stories in northern Wisconsin about Polish people stealing the Christmas tree. Now, when I say this to a lot of people in the United States who are Christians, that they get all offended. Oh my God, no, it's a holy holiday, stealing a tree, oh God, they really get upset about this. I myself even found it a little strange at first, but then I got the history on it, and what I found out was that in old Poland, before people came over here to the United States, it was monarchy. They had kings and queens in old Poland. And the peasants basically had no land. All right, the kings and the queens owned most of the real estate. The royalty owned most of the countryside. And so there was like a royal forest and so on. And so the only way a peasant could get a Christmas tree in Poland, ancient Poland, was to go out and steal one from the king's land. And of course, since the king had locked up all the land, said, "This is mine," there is a certain amount of poetic justice in having to go into the king's forest and steal that tree, because, you know, that's pretty greedy. He could have put up trees. He could have done a lot of things for people. Anyway, so this goes back to having to steal the Christmas trees from the king's forest in ancient Poland. And they brought the tradition with them to the United States. Now, it's kind of admirable, the fact that the peasants would steal their Christmas trees from the king's forest. And I have to admit that after a while, I started driving around with a few of them too, and we used to snitch trees. I also grew my own Christmas trees, but every now and then, you know, I'd hit up a spruce in the state forest or something like this and bring it home. It caught on. It rubs off after a while. So I have so many other stories that have to do with people and thieving plants and my own personal stories, but I will stay away from there because most of you guys think I'm a pretty good guy, you know, and no, I don't run around stealing stuff, do I? Well, yeah, I do. I'm a gardener. And so far, as I said, all the comments I've gotten back on that have all been agreeable. I haven't had anybody come back to me and go, "Oh, that's not true yet." Well, I'm sure if I put this video out, sooner or later I'm going to start to get some reaction where somebody refuses to agree with that idea. But all I can tell you is, trust me, I've been in this business for a long, long time, and I've observed what I've seen. Dude, it's the rules. Great horticulturalists and gardens are thieves. Hang loose, aloha, have a wonderful day.